Good afternoon and welcome to our third webinar in our four-part webinar and workshop series. Today's webinar is titled Understanding Your Resources. My name is Marcy Uline and I'm an associate professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I'm also on the editorial board for TAD, the Journal of Technology, Architecture Plus Design. Today I will be moderating this webinar and I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us. TAD is an international peer-reviewed journal of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture and is published by Taylor & Francis. The journal is dedicated to the advancement of scholarship in the field of building technology with a focus on the impact, translation, and integration of technology in architecture and design. The journal features articles on primary research in a number of fields, including emerging materials, construction techniques, design integration, structures, building systems, energy, environmental design, information technology, digital fabrication, sustainability and resiliency, project delivery, the history and theory of technology, and building technology education. For today's webinar, we have selected a group of 3 researchers that reflect diverse roles. They represent a wealth of experience in terms of personal research and in leadership of national organizations. We are pleased to share these exemplars with you. Our first panelist, Hazem Rashid Ali, is an associate professor at the Department of Architecture at the University of Texas in San Antonio. His current research focuses on sustainable and high-performance buildings and communities. He's the recipient of several research grants, both individually and as part of interdisciplinary teams, and he currently serves as the president of the Architectural Research Centers Consortium, which you may know as ARCC. He will be sharing both his own research funding experience and that he has gained through service to the profession with ARCC and also ACSA. Our second presenter, Kate Simonen, is the founding director of the Carbon Leadership Forum, an industry academic collaboration highlighting the carbon impact of the built environment and developing pathways for carbon-smart buildings to be part of the global climate solution. She is associate professor at the University of Washington. She will be sharing recommended strategies through the lens of her research work and the necessary funding to achieve such the impact that she has. Our third presenter, Ryan E. Smith, is the Associate Dean for Research and the Director of the Integrated Technology and Architecture Collaborative at the University of Utah College of Architecture and Planning. His research focuses on the question of building production, and under his directorship at ITAC, he has garnered more than $3 million in funding since 2009 from both public and private sponsors. He'll be speaking to us today on the range of funding opportunities and approaches that he undertook through the research center he directs. With that, thank you very much for attending, and I would like to present our panelists' presentations.
Good afternoon. My name is Hazem Rashid Ali. I'm an associate professor of architecture in the University of Texas at San Antonio. I also serve as the president of the Architectural Research Centers Consortium, as well as the chair of the ACSA Research and Scholarship Committee. The goal of this presentation is to discuss some strategies for obtaining external funding for architectural research projects. These strategies will be based on my experience in developing my own projects, as well as on observations gained through my roles as ARCC President and Chair of the Research and Scholarship Committee. I would like to start by discussing some general misconceptions regarding this topic. The first is that architecture faculty cannot obtain external funding for their projects. The fact is, numerous architecture faculty across almost all ACSA member schools have been successful in obtaining external funding for their work from a wide range of sources, including both traditional and non-traditional ones. Second, only architecture faculty working in technical areas can obtain funding for their projects. Our work in the ACSA Research and Scholarship Committee shows that architecture faculty representing all research areas of interest have been able to obtain external funding for their work. Finally, only faculty in research-intensive universities with strong research support structures can obtain external funding for their projects. Again, our work has shown that faculty in different types of schools have been successful in finding appropriate funding sources for their work. So, how do you develop a funded research agenda? I can identify 3 major strategies that help me in my work. The first is exploring multiple sources. Over my career, I sought funding from a variety of sources, including internal sources, both individually and in collaboration with colleagues from other disciplines, local sources, including local government, the local professional community, foundations, and industry, and national sources, including foundations and federal agencies. This diversity of sources provided me with flexibility, and increased the range of options I can pursue for different project ideas. The next strategy is incremental growth. While it is tempting to start by pursuing large grants, chances of success in obtaining these grants can be greatly increased by following a gradual approach which starts by seeking smaller grants, potentially from internal sources, and using those grants to demonstrate potential and collect preliminary data. These can then be used to go after the larger opportunities. As an example, the series of projects shown here started with an internal interdisciplinary grant which combined faculty from historic preservation, building performance, engineering, and business. The project analyzed the retrofit potential of historic homes in San Antonio. The results of this grant were then used to leverage a larger grant from the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training, which also included an interdisciplinary team. The second grant focused on one potential retrofit, radiant barriers. More recently, this work led to another project funded by the City of San Antonio to investigate the potential of installing cool roofs in low-income housing. While each project has a specific focus, they all shared a common approach and general methodology. The results from the first project were critical in obtaining the other two. The third strategy is collaboration, particularly collaboration between and across disciplines. I strongly believe that the strength of architectural research lies in developing strong interdisciplinary teams in which architectural researchers can take advantage of their ability to think creatively and combine multiple strands of knowledge. Working collaboratively, however, is not finding people who can implement the ideas of the architectural researcher, and architectural researchers need to resist their tendency to think that they can develop solutions to complex problems on their own. Effective teams respect the expertise of different team members and work together to find creative solutions to research problems. Working with other disciplines with more established research cultures can also enhance the architectural faculty's research expertise. In addition to the residential retrofits project, I also worked with colleagues from education and science to investigate the potential of using augmented reality in the teaching of energy efficiency principles, and had other collaborations with engineering, business, public policy, and the local practice community in a variety of projects. Now we will move on to discuss some general observations regarding externally funded research in schools of architecture based on my service roles in ARCC and ACSA. The ACSA Research and Scholarship Committee recently conducted a survey of externally funded research projects in schools of architecture. The survey received 110 responses representing 207 projects. 21 projects were excluded because they only listed internal funding sources or did not list any. The remaining 186 projects from 101 faculty representing 62 schools of architecture were analyzed. Only 35 of these schools were research intensive or R1 universities. The first finding we can point to is the diversity of interest within the projects we received. This chart shows the distribution of the respondents' research areas of interest based on the ACSA Index of Scholarship classification. This chart, on the other hand, shows the areas of research focus of the projects themselves. In both cases, the projects we received represented every research area in the ACSA classification, including areas not typically associated with external funding, such as architectural history, theory, and design process. With regard to funding amounts, as can be seen in this chart, architectural research projects cover a wide range of funding amounts from very small projects to very large ones. Contrary to what some may think, architecture faculty have been successful in obtaining large, externally funded projects, including several at the $1 million and higher level. Looking at funding sources, the results of the survey support my earlier point about the need to seek multiple and varied sources of funding, including both traditional and non-traditional ones. This chart shows the wide range of funding sources we saw, including local and state sources, industry sources, national foundations and associations, as well as federal funding agencies. For example, the survey identified 13 projects funded by the National Science Foundation, one of the most difficult and competitive agencies to obtain funding from. Another major characteristic of the projects we received is the high percentage of interdisciplinary projects. About 55% of the projects received represented some form of inter- or cross-disciplinary collaboration. The percentage among the larger projects was much higher. The range of disciplines architecture faculty collaborate with is very diverse, ranging from engineering and sciences, the social sciences, the humanities, and the arts. We also noted the uses of the funding and the outcomes of the project. Funding was provided for scholarships, fellowships, and other student support. Faculty were funded to write courses, sponsor studios, or complete design-build projects. Research outcomes were disseminated through both traditional means, such as conference papers, articles, and book publications, as well as more architecturally oriented products, such as design guidelines, exhibitions, software development, building documentation, prototypes, proof of concept models, and material testing. I would like to conclude with going back to my comments about the importance of collaboration and building strong relationships in developing a funded research agenda. That includes building relationships with other researchers, both within schools of architecture and outside, building relationships with different units within the university, such as research centers and institutes, which can offer infrastructure support and provide access to sources of funding, and building relationships with potential local and national sources of funding. At the local level, that requires engaging with local agencies and organizations, while at the national level, this involves contacting program officers to discuss project ideas and get feedback and guidance. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kate Simonen, and I'm an associate professor of architecture at the University of Washington, and I'm really happy to be here today and share with you some of my perspective on funded research. I'm director of the Carbon Leadership Forum. This is an industry academic research collaborative focused on understanding and reducing the carbon impact of the built environment with an emphasis on building materials and construction. We work together on both research and education and outreach projects looking to help transform the built environment to a carbon smart future. Additionally, we've convened the Embodied Carbon Network. This is an open access resource of communication and action and open to anyone, and we'd welcome you to join if you're interested. The publications of the Carbon Leadership Forum group are in a range of venues, including academic journals, books, professional reports, and practice guides. So I've been asked to address a range of questions about funded research, and I'm going to do so with a focus on increasing value and impact of work. And I'm going to outline some strategies to attain funding and use different case studies to highlight those. So strategic curiosity. Curiosity is a necessary criteria for a researcher. The strategic part is about trying to identify which of the things you're curious about are most impactful for you to focus your efforts on. When I started as a faculty member at the University of Washington, my research interests ranged from understanding steel detailing practices globally to the use of environmental life cycle assessment to understand and choose building materials and residential prefabrication. And what I found in that early work is that there was a community of building industry professionals looking to understand more about the carbon impact of materials and who were interested in collaborating to advance that knowledge. We came together and formed the Carbon Leadership Forum as an industry-supported academic collaborative. We meet annually and share best practices. Here's a workshop in which we are meeting to identify actions to overcome obstacles to low carbon construction. And this group of passionate individuals and their organizations help us be effective so that we work together developing initiatives and projects, and the funding that the CLF sponsors provides enables us to have staffing and consistent development of work. A second strategy is assertive leadership. as academics, we aren't necessarily empowered to be the leader, and in many cases we need to step up and assert that we can do this. So strategic choices and an identification of where there's leadership vacuum provides an opportunity for greater impact of research. In 2010, the Carbon Leadership Forum recognized that environmental product declarations are a good way to be able to choose between different carbon impact of products, and that concrete was an opportunity for a significant impact in low carbon materials. At that time, there were very few product category rules or the standards for creating an environmental product declaration available, and we identified that per international standards, these were expected to be developed up through industry, and we organized and developed a committee to create a product category rule for concrete, and managed to get support from the National Ready Mix Concrete Association, the Portland Cement Association, the Precast Concrete Association in terms of in-kind participation on the committee, and which then later led to increased sponsorship of the Carbon Leadership Forum and adoption of the standard as the use of ready-mix concrete throughout North America. Another example of asserted leadership is through achieving funding at the Washington State Legislature. Academic research work can inform policy, and in 2 instances we identified proposed policy around the environmental impact of building materials that could benefit from increased understanding of life cycle assessment and design and construction practices. In 2011, we were funded to do work around whole building life cycle assessment, and just recently were funded to do a study about green procurement using environmental product declarations. Patience. So patience is the long game of understanding and building up support. The Pankow Foundation funds design and construction related innovation projects. I first approached the Pankow Foundation in 2010 with a proposal related to low carbon construction. At that time, they informed me that it didn't match their strategic mission at that time, and that the work was not far enough advanced. Over the following years, I kept them up to date on the research work that we were doing, and their mission evolved to include sustainability and low carbon construction, and at that time then we were well poised to submit a grant for funding, and were successful. In order for the Pankow Foundation to fund that project, they need to have co-sponsors to demonstrate significant impact and interest, or maybe the value, more appropriately, to verify the value of this work. Bringing on Skanska USA. Skanska was interested in better understanding the carbon impact of construction, so they wanted to expand the project to include a study to assess the embodied carbon per square meter or square foot of typical construction. And the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality was looking to advance LCA practice and wanted to understand the environmental impact of tenant improvement work, including mechanical electrical systems as well as the interior finishes. So it was approximately 7 years from the first contact with this foundation till when we got the funding. National Science Foundation grants are rarely given to architects as the lead PI. And so integrating into NSF teams requires some flexibility in the collaboration. This interdisciplinary team, headed up by engineers at Colorado State University and University of Oklahoma, was focused on tornado resilience and community decision making, and the grant required a sustainability component. So they were fairly well defined, well along on the definition of the project by the time they were connected with me as a potential of bringing in environmental impacts. And I had not done any work around tornado resilience. And so this was a stretch, but it was a very valuable stretch. I've had some productive collaborations with the engineering team, and we received funding to support undergraduate research workers, in addition to the modest stipend that came with the NSF proposal. So on the left here is an example of an undergraduate student who's done phenomenal work about understanding the lifespan of buildings. The last strategy I'd like to identify is being ambitious. We are currently looking forward in the next 5 to 10 years about the type of work that we would like to do. And we've been working with a team of people to come up with identify a theory of change of how we would get to a carbon positive or carbon smart future. So we're identifying action plans and specific projects. And by being able to articulate how the impact of individual projects add up to a desired future state, that we can demonstrate the value of individual projects on the near term. So thank you very much. That's a brief overview of several research projects, and I look forward to future discussion.
My name is Ryan Smith. I'm an associate professor and associate dean for research in the College of Architecture and Planning at the University of Utah. I direct the Integrated Technology and Architecture Collaborative, or ITAC for short, that started on the back of a Department of Energy grant with colleague Jorg Rugemer in 2009. The collaborative has grown, changed, and evolved since that time. We're fundamentally concerned with the question of production, the process and products of design and construction. You can see related topic areas that we're also interested in. The range of funding source categories that ITAC has been awarded are shown on the x-axis in these charts. The one on the left illustrates the funding categories and number of awards from these organizations, while the chart at the right illustrates the same categories versus the amount of funding in US dollars. The categories are separated into internal funding in blue and external funding in yellow. The internal funding sources are those that come from my university proper. The external funding sources include government grants from international, federal, and state entities. There's also external funding from trade associations, companies, consultancy, or work that is not processed through the University Grants Office, and donations that are given directly to ITAC without restriction of a deliverable. This image shows the same funding source categories with 3 examples for each. For internal funding sources, I have received funding from the Vice President for Research Office through the Internal Seed Grant Program. You probably have a similar program at your university. Internal grants like this are generally set up to support faculty in seeding research for larger external funding down the road, or to forge key partnerships in order to realize greater impact of the work in the future. The University of Utah Facilities Department has also partnered with ITAC in the past to work on projects such as post-occupancy evaluation. In the interest of time, I won't go into the external funding organizations, but you can see they're quite diverse. In my experience, seeking financial support for research work can be described on a scale from opportunistic to entrepreneurial. Opportunistic refers to RFP responses, or external organizations approaching the university for engagement. The researcher responds to the opportunity, but it may require altering or creatively massaging the research direction in order to accommodate the opportunity. Entrepreneurial is a mode in which the researcher identifies a question and then determines what organizations would benefit from answering the question. The researcher fosters the quote-unquote investor organization. An example of opportunistically responding to an RFP is this project titled Prefab Wood. Every other year, the U.S. Department of Agriculture releases an Innovation Grant, RFP. The requirements of the RFP are for applied research that studies the wood utilization market. I thought how to take my research domain of offsite construction and ask a question relevant to the grant. I reached out to local panel and modular companies to see if we might submit a proposal for a 3-year research project to develop a supply chain and test it in multifamily projects. This ultimately would lead to greater volume of wood used in buildings and meet the interests of the grant RFP. As a university partner, ITAC's primary contribution was to set up the research protocols and collect data in the factory and on the job site with time-lapse cameras. The analysis quantified the added value of panels and modules to the delivery of housing in the Salt Lake Valley. RFP work is very challenging due to the reporting and assessment process often required in government-funded work. Between opportunist and entrepreneur mode of seeking research funding is this example project, Solid Timber Construction. This project was a mix of RFP-responded work and finding matching partners. The research question was how mass timber projects compared to site-built projects for a variety of parameters. I negotiated with the Forest Products Laboratory in their development side, not the research side, to support a market-type study. This was leveraged to get matching funding from FP Innovations and then apply for the AIA Upjohn with partner letters in tow. The project is a mix of methods including surveys and interviews of architects, contractors, and mass timber fabricators on the respective 17 case studies identified. An example of an entrepreneurial project is Leading Collaborative Architectural Practice, which has been in partnership with Aaron Caraher, a colleague of mine at Utah. The research question is, what are the social aspects of collaborative delivery that architects can apply to garner influence in contemporary practice? It started with service on the AIA National Committee, who then funded a 2-year project to apply social behavioral science and business leadership research to the field of architecture. We worked with the profession, especially the local AIA, to research and develop a national continuing education program. These resources were then adapted into a book published by Wiley that is used in various classes today. Often these projects have a deliverable of a report much longer than an individual paper that becomes the basis for peer-reviewed outcomes of, say, a journal article. Research projects, in my opinion, should lead to the next research question by identifying gaps in knowledge and potential partners and even funding sources that can be applied to a later project. The challenges of entrepreneurial work include negotiating intellectual property and copyright terms so that you as a researcher can benefit long-term and publish your work. Another challenge is that commercial funders often do not like the overhead rate at the university and want to negotiate on this. This is a list of partners we have worked with in ITAC over the years. Included in this list are funding partners, intellectual partners, industry partners, and otherwise. The point is that no matter where the project falls on the opportunistic and entrepreneurial scale, it is my opinion that built environment research requires many partnerships, personal marketing, and extensive communication. Furthermore, public speaking and networking is just part of this equation. This graph illustrates the number of invited public lectures that are non-peer-reviewed, meaning they're not conference paper presentations, but keynote addresses, public presentations, etc., that I have personally given since 2004. The more others hear of your research and work, the greater opportunities there are for funding partners in the future, especially if you're speaking at industry and government events, not necessarily academic events. Likewise, this image shows the workshops and continuing professional development events that ITAC has put on since 2009. These events are intended to share the knowledge of research required in many grant programs, but also to identify future funders and partners. As a side note, sometimes a researcher may need to ask their administrator for travel funds to make connections for a new direction, wherever the potential funder is located. An effective use of time is to perform service on boards and organizations that can benefit your research agenda properly. Even RFP government grants come from relationships, frankly. With the U.S. Department of Agricultural grants in ITAC, half of them have been relation-based and non-competitive, while the other half come from RFP proposals. If funding continues to be an issue, then one might consider starting an organization to support the research work. This has much effort involved in order to get work funded, but it can be sustainable far into the future. For example, in 2012, seeing off-site construction growing, I approached the National Institute of Building Sciences with industry partners to start a new council on off-site construction. A long story short, the council was launched in 2013 and I served as its first chair. This council meets quarterly and has provided funding and partnerships at great length for my research work. In closing, I would suggest that as a researcher, although you will seek out RFP funding that matches your interests, don't stop asking commercially value-added questions. Gather partners and engage in entrepreneurial work. In this way, opportunistic funding searches can augment ongoing research questions being asked with industry. This is different than perhaps the traditional research funding search model, but one that I believe can be more sustainable in the current uncertain funding climate, and one that responds to the economic culture of the U.S. Finally, the outcomes of the entrepreneurial research work can be directly applied to design and construction practice with more immediate impacts. Thank you.
So good afternoon. My name is Marcy Uline, and we have our panelists here to have a discussion with us today. I want to thank you for attending, and thanks to our panelists for these thoughtful presentations. We've had the first question come in about getting access to the slides, and I just want to remind everyone that the video of this presentation will be available on the ACSA websites within a couple days, and so you'll be able to have access there and be able to share it with your colleagues in department. Also, please note you can use the chat to go ahead and send questions to us. We will see them and get them in the queue. But I'd like to welcome our panelists and ask the very first question. And that is, you've all demonstrated that you're quite accomplished in receiving funding for your projects, but perhaps we have some new researchers with us today. So can you speak about the first time you applied for funding, what that experience was like, and also what your experience with success rates when asking and applying for grants?
Who would you like to go first, Marcy?
Well, Ryan, why don't we have you go first?
Speak up in a committee meeting and you get an assignment. No, the first time I received funding, a bit unique in that during my Master of Architecture studies at UC Berkeley, my advisor had just stepped down as the department chair, Mary Camario. She's now retired. And she brought me in on a grant at UC Berkeley dealing with seismic response or multi-hazard mitigation response. And then because of that experience, I was able to help write a proposal while working on my Master of Architecture and got familiar with that process. And then at University of Oregon, my first teaching appointment, I worked on an NSF grant with Christine Theodoropoulos. And I didn't write that grant, but I definitely was part of some of the reporting process. So when I got to University of Utah, my first tenure line appointment, I had experience with FEMA grants because of the hazard mitigation work. So I approached some partners on campus and we started down that path. And I didn't realize how much work it was going to be trying to organize partners. I mean, it literally took 3 months to write that grant, but you know, it was a big win. It was an $800,000 grant. So that was kind of my first experience realizing that large grant proposals, RFP or not RFP, whether they're kind of commercial work, require extensive communication if you're going to be the hub of that grant and the PI of that grant. So that's some of my first experience.
Hazem, you want to jump in?
Sure. Actually, my very first funding experience was applying for funding for my master's program, which actually ties into the second part of the question about success rates, because it took me 4 attempts in 4 subsequent years to actually get funding, and every year I moved a step further. So the first year I was eliminated from round 1. The second year I went to the second round. The third year they actually interviewed me, which was quite exciting. And then the fourth year I actually got funded. So it does take patience. It does take a lot of times of trial and error. Then during my PhD, I was again fortunate enough to get a couple of opportunities to apply for funding. And in that case, I think what I needed to do is to talk to people who have received these types of funding before, essentially ask what the reviewers are looking for, try to shape my application in a way that meets the objectives of the program. Then in UTSA, the very first opportunity I managed to get was an internal seed grant program. And what happened then is that SBSE, the Society of Building Science Educators, had a program called the Carbon Neutral Building, and they invited faculty from across the country to participate in that. So I participated in that program, and then I used this as a leverage to apply for our internal seed grant programs, and I think that was the fact that I was tied in with an international group like that was very helpful for me to get funding on my very first try in a seed grant program in UTSA. So it does take patience. It takes developing relationships. You need to learn from others who have gone through the experience before you, and I think be flexible in terms of how you shape your work to the demands and needs of specific programs.
Thank you. Kate, do you have something to add?
Well, I'll talk about the first grant I applied to when joining the University of Washington, which was not successful and in retrospect was fairly naive, but I learned an incredible amount. So I think just even the process of applying for, that was a federal grant through National Institute of Standards and Technology, the process of applying through the university and applying through the federal system was very informative. So I would encourage anybody who is interested in potential research funding to try, because in the process of trying, you learn.
Can I add
Great,
something
thank you.
to that?
Please, Ryan,
okay?
go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say that I go back to both Kate and Hazem's presentation about, and I mentioned it as well, relationships. And one is, if you're planning on applying for a particular grant, the grant associations, whether that's federal or foundation, highly encourage the interaction of the researcher or the PI with their organization. So for instance, for NSF, call up the directorate for the organization that you want to apply for and ask them questions if your idea or the idea that you're trying to propose is a good one and is appropriate for that program, because you'll spend a lot of time spinning your wheels if it doesn't match up. You won't know that until months after the review process. And so it's good to have an idea of what that's going to take before you apply for the grant, and then ensure that you get adequate feedback when you are denied, because that's how you respond to that feedback. And if you don't get any feedback, I would ask for it. I would demand it, because otherwise they're just not going to get people applying for that grant if they don't provide it.
Great, thank you. And I had recently heard that most people don't apply the second time, and so they don't actually get to incorporate that feedback, and so you're losing an opportunity by not incorporating it and trying again. We have a question from our participants, and the question was sort of, how do you even start to find what grants are appropriate to your research areas? Where do you begin to search? What are some resources that you can help with that? Ryan, did you want to start that one?
Sure. I think it's a value proposition question. And I know that's a funny word because it's a business word, but it tends to be how I think about these things. Who does the question actually who actually benefits from the question you're asking, or who could benefit from the question you're asking? And if it's the end user, meaning society, then you have to ask who represents society at that juncture. And then ultimately that traces back to who potentially could fund it. There are foundations that have particular interests. There are government agencies, for instance, the NSF we've mentioned, is really interested in innovation and new knowledge. If you're not presenting new knowledge, it potentially probably won't be interested in that proposal. But if it's more applied and maybe has commercial value, there might be commercial entities that have interest in that particular question. So that's often how I start. Is you have a question, you have the value statement that you're interested in, you've got to find a match for whoever out there might benefit from that.
Okay, Kate Hazem.
I would actually second. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to note that it's not simple and it takes time. So it takes understanding the different programs and the type of work that they fund to be able to understand what they would value. So it takes time of reviewing past awards, what types of projects that they have awarded in the past, and how you might fit your work into this to where they are recognizing that value that Ryan was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I would agree with both answers. So I think the first question, like Ryan mentioned, is what is it that you want to do? What is the question? And who is the appropriate audience? There are a lot of databases now that can give you potential sources of funding, but you really have to narrow the focus down, or you will be overwhelmed to the ones that you feel are most appropriate, and then drill down and do the research about what are these sources interested in, what typical projects have they funded before, and so on. And most universities will have departments that would support you in doing that, identifying opportunities for you, maybe coming up with previous examples that these funding agencies have funded. and then there is the you going out and finding your own source part for a project that you feel is important and that talks to a specific audience. That too could be an approach to use.
Right, and so just to add on to that, as you mentioned, there may be someone in your department who knows that. There may be somebody in the university. You may have a foundations or external funding office at your university. The other thing is just to mention is grants.gov, right? Is a primary starting point for national grants. Another question that has come in for Ryan, but I think is appropriate for everyone, is did you publish while you were seeking funding, or did the publications come after? What's the relationship between that work?
Shall I go, Ryan?
Yes, please.
Yeah, publishing and grants certainly go hand in hand, but they can also be divergent sometimes because it takes a lot of time to produce a grant proposal, and especially when it's an RFP responded one, you're going to want to do your literature review early on so you know that you're asking the right question, and also can support the justification for asking that question through previous research, and that demonstrating there is a gap. And when you do that literature review, oftentimes that provides the basis for a paper, especially a robust journal article, because you have to lay out that case in the beginning of a journal article as well. But to the point of, do you publish during it? I think if there's something you encounter along the way that's of value and you think is a breakthrough or new knowledge or clarifying knowledge in some way, there's an opportunity to publish. I think too many times, especially in architectural research and architectural scholarship, the idea of publishing research maybe isn't a tradition. It's more about kind of criticism, right? And that's been the form of publishing. But this is a different kind of publication. This is stating where the field is, and then what question are you asking related to that, and what gap are you filling with some knowledge and demonstrating it. With regards to area of prefabrication, sorry to be brief here, I was really skeptical whether I should write a book or not when I first started an academic career. But I have to be honest, for me personally, and this may not be everyone's case, but writing Prefab Architecture, published by Wiley in 2010, laid out a numerous subsequent series of events that led to grants and publications and partnerships that I couldn't have realized had I not written that book. And so for me personally, writing a synthesis book, which was not a research book, it was simply a codification book of existing knowledge and speculation, and then allowing that to sit on a shelf and get the interest of potential partners and funders. So.
If I can jump in here, I think there are two questions here. First, is funding a goal in its own right? And my personal view is that no, it's not. Funding is a tool that allows you to have an impact of some sort. That impact could be scholarly through publications. It could be through other means of production, but it should have an impact. A research project that doesn't have an impact is really not a very useful research project. So going back to the original questions, I would argue that yes, you should be publishing before, as Ryan mentioned. You can publish about what is it that you want to do. You can publish about your literature review. You should be publishing during, if you get interesting findings that you can publish, say, in a conference. That also gives you an opportunity to get some feedback on what you're doing and maybe make some adjustments. And then certainly after, you should disseminate the results either through the traditional norms like publications, books, journals, conference proceedings, and so on, or even non-traditional means, symposia, prototypes, things like that. Whatever it is that is more appropriate for your project, I think you should pursue, but there really has to be an impact for the research project. The second question relates to risk. Going after external funding does have a risk involved because you may get it, you may not get it. So I've always liked to have a parallel path. And now I'm talking about tenure and promotion decisions and these processes that do require faculty to have a level of production. Once you have a funded research program going, then you're great. But as you're developing one, I think it's wise to have a parallel line in which you are having another form of production that would supplement you in case your funding activities take time to yield fruit, if you will.
Kate?
Well, I think, I guess what I'd highlight is that it's a juggling act, because if you're working to advance work, you're putting in proposals, and then you're executing work, and then you need to disseminate it. And so I think it's I guess I would highlight that you want to have a strategy from the very beginning. So like Hazam was saying, that that the work that you're investing in proposals has an outcome no matter where that goes, and that even that you have that you plan ahead to make sure that you can disseminate the work, both, especially in things that are like looking for professional reports where the deliverable is not may or may not be a public document, figuring out ways in which you can disseminate that so that it really has the impact of research, as opposed to just answering an individual question. So to have a broader research impact, you have to have a publication strategy of some sort.
Great. Thank you. So another question that's come in to us is about overhead rates, and particularly lowering overhead rates, and how much the university takes out of a grant. And so the question is, how do we reduce that? And perhaps this is relevant because many of you have indicated that you've worked with some non-traditional funders who may not be used to giving this. So what are some of the strategies that you've used?
I think most universities are open. There is always that federal rate, which ranges between 40–50%, sometimes more than that. But most universities that I'm aware of are usually flexible enough to accommodate funding sources that either don't pay the full amount percentage, or in some cases don't pay any. So if you have a funding source that has that policy, it makes things a lot easier, because you can point to that and say, okay, this is an important funding source, it's good for my project, but they don't allow for overhead. And again, in my case at least, the university has always been open to accepting that. In some cases, it may take some negotiation between the funding agency and your research support structure in the university, but at least in my personal experience, I've always been able to lower that rate, and in some cases eliminate that rate.
Ryan, how about you? What your experience? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead. So similarly, it is sometimes possible to negotiate the university overhead rate, but I found it's easier to negotiate it ahead of time. So in the sponsored work for the CLF, that's negotiated as gift donation. So as a gift, it doesn't have overhead rate, but then there's no required deliverable either. So that's a way of negotiating with people who are interested in supporting the work, a way of having no overhead by convincing them to give it as a gift. Then my work is under the Center for Integrated Design, which is an off-campus facility. Doesn't pay the same overhead to the university, but has to pay overhead for the space. So I think also when you're talking to sponsors from a professional organization front, the overhead might seem high, except when you put it in context that we still need space and computers and light and heat, and all businesses have some overhead. I think it's also about how you explain what you're delivering, so that I think it depends on the funding source, how you can articulate it and how you can adjust it.
Thank you, Kate. Ryan, did you have anything to add?
No, I think they pretty much covered it. I think those are great points.
Okay, so when we got a comment in from one of our participants that said, we talked about finding grants. They said they suggested again looking at grant submissions that have been successful, grant search, university grant search offices, pivot community scholars, looking at past awards. But they also mentioned finding a mentor and or being on the boards of allied organizations, right? So I know Ryan, you mentioned that, and I think you all have some experience with that. Would you like to speak about that a little bit more?
I made a point about that in my presentation. If you know the kinds of organizations that you need to get funding from, think it's very beneficial to try and serve in that organization, and whether that's on a board position or, for instance, if it's a federal agency that offers grants, go and offer to sit on their panels for review of those grants. And by doing so, you'll not only get closer to understanding what kind of proposals are coming in for this type of grants and what's being awarded, because you're part of the decision-making process for those awards, but you also get to know the key players and the individuals. If it's a trade association like the American Institute of Architects that we've done work with, sit on some of their national committees, and you'll realize the kind of issues that they're dealing with. And so if you want to apply directly and negotiate something with them, that's possible at lower amounts, or if you want to apply for the La Trobe or the Upjohn, you'll know the issues that that particular organization is concerned with. And so I think, just as a touch point, it's a good way to understand that value creation question that I had, and see how your particular interests might merge with that particular organization.
Great. Kate, did you want to add anything to that?
I'd add about how to find mentors. So it overlaps with the value of interdisciplinary collaboration. So early in my time at the University of Washington, I searched out faculty who, particularly in engineering, but also in school forest resources, who were doing research that I thought was interesting, or who I thought might be interested in collaborating. And not everybody was interested in. So I'd sent out a range of email introductions, and I got some responses. And from the some that I got responses, I set up times to meet with them or put in proposals. And I found really generous mentorship from a range of different faculty members who critiqued my proposal. So for example, that was, I was asked for them to evaluate a proposal or consider applying for a proposal with me. And then those have grown into future collaborations in some cases. In other cases, it's introductions to other teams. So for example, the NSF project that I'm on was introduced to by a UW faculty member who I've never worked with, but met in that early way. So you can build up your own mentorship base by being brave.
I can relate to the same experience, because I did the very same thing when I first arrived at UTSA. Sent out a lot of emails, got ignored by most of them, but the few that did respond are really good colleagues and collaborators that I've been working on for many years now. I would also second Ryan's comments about the importance of networking and in some cases volunteering for activities, whether at the local, regional, or national levels. Again, it's these relationships that can very easily develop into future projects. And even if they don't, just understanding what happens at these organizations, at these committees, at these boards and councils help me at least develop my ideas and the kind of things that I would like to work on and how I present them to the public.
Thank you. And there's a question that's come in about sitting on a grant review board or grant review panel. Have you all had experience with that? And how does one get to be a grant reviewer?
I did, yes, and I think in some cases I was invited to it, and others I was proactive and I reached out to the organization asking if I could participate, and it is an incredible experience, and I think Ryan mentioned that before. Just being there where the decisions are being made, looking at what are the things that reviewers look at is very helpful.
Okay, Ryan or Kate?
No, I don't have anything to add to that. But I same kind of thing. I've just been proactive and trying to sit on them and contact them and ask if I can help in that way. And it's usually after a phone conversation about, is my proposal appropriate for your program? The answer is no. And then I say, well, can I sit on a panel then? And usually the answer is yes. So.
That's great. Okay, we have time for just one more question. And the question is about what type of level of support can you ask your department for? Are you writing in time to release yourself from teaching so that you can run this grant, or are you getting actually staff members that help with pulling the report together and doing things that your grant requires?
I might speak to that. Most universities, I should say R1 universities in particular, usually have resources on campus that you can leverage if you have a large proposal. Even a foundational proposal, they'll offer those support services. So there is support on campus, but particular to your unit, say your college or your department. Yes, I think you can negotiate that, especially if you're a tenure-line faculty member and you're trying to develop your research agenda. I think most administrators are sympathetic to that. They have pressures from the university for their faculty to produce research and scholarship, and so it only benefits them. And you might want to ask your dean or your department chair. We have started a program here at Utah that I head up that offers seed incentive funding within the college proper. It's not just a seed incentive program at the university level. It's within the college, and that is in order to allow you to either hire students and others in order to gather that preliminary data. So that's a little bit about what we've done.
I think it's it's similar to it is a relationship. It's highly relationship and situationally based, however, right? So it's understanding what your institution has and what opportunities they have and who in your department or college has the knowledge and ability to help. So I think it depends, in the time that I've been at UW, it's ebbed and flowed a little bit based on who's the dean and who's the staff and what's available.
I would add that in the cases in which you may not be able to get support at your unit level for whatever reason, there may be value in trying to link your teaching and your research together. In that way, you're benefiting in both areas. If you can do that, I would argue you're enriching the educational experience of your students, but you're also providing support for your research. So that may be a potential route if these resources are not available at the unit level for whatever reason.
I would emphasize, I would agree. That's if you can tailor a seminar, a studio, you can get a lot of the foundational work done while you teach.
Great, thank you very much. We have just a minute left, and I want to thank once again our panelists for their time and sharing their incredible experiences with us. There's much for us to look forward and work towards. I also want to thank our attendees today. Thank you for joining us for the third webinar, and remind everyone that the next webinar is talking about impact and dissemination, and that will be on April 20th, and we certainly hope that you can join us then. Once again, thank you all for your time, and have a great afternoon.